Welcome back to the Kyle Olson Show. Now that Joe Biden has been affirmed as the president-elect by the Congress and President Trump has said he will facilitate a smooth transition, how will American policy change towards China? Joining me now to discuss what changes we'll likely see is John Carney, finance and economics editor, and my colleague at Breitbart News. So what are the sort of kind of top-line changes do you expect to see in the public and private sectors during a Biden administration?
We are going to see a warming towards China. One of the things the Trump administration was willing to do that no one else in, frankly, American history has done is being able to unilaterally stand up to China. In other words, not wait for the okay from whatever global organization, whether it's the World Trade Organization or the UN or whoever, to say, or NATO, to say, yeah, go ahead and we'll let you pass some sort of sanction against China, being willing to go ahead and do it on its own. Joe Biden has already said he doesn't want to do this. He's going to try to build a coalition. He's going to find that he's unable to build an international coalition against China, just as all his predecessors have found. And so there will be a softening of American policy to China because that's what our allies around the world will require.
So you wrote a story at Breitbart.com. New York Stock Exchange withdraws plans to delist 3 Chinese telcos. Why was that significant?
So this was very interesting. A week and a half ago, the New York Stock Exchange announced, in compliance with an executive order from President Trump, that they were going to delist 3 Chinese companies because those companies were tied to the Chinese military. In many ways, this is true of a lot of very big Chinese companies, particularly tech companies. They're tied to the Chinese military. We have laws that say that U.S. investors should not be aiding the Chinese military. Donald Trump made this actionable by saying investors shouldn't be investing in these companies that are tied to the military. These 3 companies were initially scheduled to be delisted. Then the New York Stock Exchange reversed this and said, well, we've been told by people inside the administration that we don't actually have to reverse this. And the thinking was, Joe Biden's coming in. There's only a couple weeks left of the Trump administration. This is probably more about the bureaucrats saying, look, you don't have to do this because Biden won't require it. So the next step, though, is very interesting because this obviously caused some outrage and surprise. Apparently, the White House was surprised. The Treasury Department was surprised. So this was coming from not top-level Trump administration, people saying, don't worry about it. It was deep state, permanent bureaucracy saying, don't worry about it. Because behind the scenes, new Treasury Secretary Mnuchin said, guys, you are supposed to delist these 3 companies. And so just 2 days after they reversed themselves about delisting, they re-reversed themselves and said, now we are going to delist. So at least as things stand right now, those 3 companies are supposed to come off the New York Stock Exchange. It may come back on once Biden's president, but for now, they're coming off.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask. What is stopping the Biden administration from just rescinding that executive order?
Zero. And in fact, they very well might. It's possible that these things will be contested. One of the things we saw in the Trump administration was that federal judges actually stood in the way of Trump rescinding executive orders issued by Barack Obama, which seems a little crazy. There was no judicial review of the initial order. Why would there be a judicial review of rescinding the order? It doesn't, it's not a law passed by Congress. And yet we saw precedent being set for courts being willing to stop it. I don't know if they'll stop Biden from just willy-nilly rescinding Trump executive orders. Probably not. But it's possible somebody can try to stand in the way, put it in a lawsuit. But frankly, I think we're, as part of the great softening towards China, I do expect we'll see things like that executive order get pulled back.
So I wanted to get your reaction to this story. The Chinese Communist regime is saying Joe Biden will, quote, restore normalcy between the 2 countries. It seems to me that normalcy didn't work out so well for American workers, but how do you see it?
That's right. Normalcy means the one-sided trade relationship that we had with China. It means ascendant China, America in decline. That's what the pre-Trump normal was. That's what China is referring to. And they're largely right. Look, Biden has said he's talked tough on China, but he's also said that he's not going to act alone. So that means that many other countries, Germany, France, around the world will have to come on board. They weren't able to do this before. They weren't willing to do it. The question is, why would they do it now? What makes Joe Biden think they would? And one of the things China has the ability to do is make grand promises about the future, for left-wing priorities such as climate change. Right? What China will promise is to go all electric with their vehicles by 2030, and in exchange for the U.S. dropping all the tariffs. I think Joe Biden would go for that kind of thing, and China is more than willing to make that promise.
And then in 2025 or whatever, to pick a year, a few years from now, they just ignore it. Or maybe...
Or they'll go ahead with it, but what they will demand is that the rest of the world make all the electric cars in China. So they'll be willing to go all electric, but they'll also say, well, we can only do that if we build giant factories to build electric cars in China, and we're only going to do that if you let us export our electric cars into your market, destroying the jobs in your country. That is the bargain that China is going to try to drive. And the question is, will we have people willing to stand up to them, or will they accept the kind of climate change blackmail that China is likely to engage in? And frankly, everything I've seen says the Biden administration is not only not willing to stand up to this, they're totally unprepared for what China is going to do. They don't look at China. And we've heard Joe Biden say this, where he said, China is going to be a competitor to us. They don't look at China as a smart, strong competitor. They underestimate China. And this, frankly, just plays into China's hands.
So the Chinese foreign minister said that a Biden administration is a new window of hope, and he said it's opening. What happens to the American economy and U.S. jobs if China's power grows and there's a sympathizer like Joe Biden in the White House?
Right, jobs go away. What China wants to be is the high-tech manufacturer center of the entire world. So they want all the chip manufacturing, all the computer manufacturing, all the smart device manufacturing, all the 5G, all the electric cars, all the solar panels to be made in China. They're willing to let go of a lot of the things we think of as made in China, plastic devices. Those will be made in Vietnam. Those will be made in other Asian countries. They're getting rid of that. They took all of that from the U.S., but now they're exporting the manufacturing of that to other countries as they move up the ramp. And frankly, there's nowhere else to go. It used to be the promise, well, we're not going to make the cheap stuff, but we'll make the good high-tech stuff. That's what China's going for now. They're going to take those jobs from Americans unless we stand up to China.
So do you foresee when you have a Democrat president, Democrat House, Democrat Senate, favorable, status with China or relations, do you see us as a country and as an economy going back to the 90s, back to the 2000s, where we were losing jobs, we were losing jobs to China, to Mexico, et cetera? Is that where we're heading?
I have a little bit of hope. I do think we will head there, except that there are some Democrats who come from blue-collar districts, who remember what happened when China entered the WTO, remember the lies that were told about how China was, going to be buying tons of stuff from the United States, and may be willing to form a coalition with the newly populist members of the Republican Party and stand up against this. Remember, we had a bipartisan consensus from 2000, basically from the mid-90s through 2015, that said we're not going to stand up to China, that we're going to assist China's growth. I think it's possible we could build a bipartisan, and maybe I'm just being too hopeful, but I'm just going to say it's possible we could build a bipartisan consensus to stand up against China. I don't expect the leadership for that to come from the Biden White House, but I am hopeful that the midterm elections, the next presidential election, that we will see building momentum towards standing up for China, because I don't think people are under the same illusions today that they were under in 1999.
Well, and of course, with the narrow majority that the Democrats have in the House, well, and of course the Senate, all it takes is a handful of, are you talking like Tim Ryan and those sorts of Democrats?
Sure. And Joe Manchin, he doesn't want to see Americans lose jobs to China. And we have an advantage this time around. Back in 1999, when those of us who were economic nationalists were saying, admitting China to the WTO was going to be a disaster. They were going to take jobs. They were going to be predatory. They weren't going to live up to their obligations, and that this would be economic suicide. We were predicting something that was going to happen, and the other experts said, no, these are fear mongers. Of course, that's not going to happen. It'll all work out great. Well, we don't have to predict. We know what happened. The history is now there. This isn't just fighting over forecasts. We know what happens when China is allowed access to the U.S. market and allowed to keep the U.S. out of its market. So I think we have an advantage this time. I think we can do better in stopping China.
Interesting. John Carney, finance and economics editor, and my colleague at Breitbart News. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
This is the Kyle Olson Show. We'll be right back.